Welcome back, everyone, to the deep dive in Season 9. This season, we're going deep, really deep, into the world of the Syriac Early Church Fathers. Think of these figures as the architects, the foundation builders of early Christian thought. They really shaped how we understand Christian theology today, how we interpret the Bible, and even those very strict, those ascetic practices that some Christians adopted.
Absolutely.
And for this particular deep dive, we're zeroing in on a truly remarkable figure, Babai the Great. We're going to explore how this individual left his mark, an unforgettable one, on the Church of the East during a time when things were, well, let's just say, pretty turbulent.
Yes, very much so.
But before we get into the thick of it, I want to highlight that the research we're drawing on today, it comes from the work of Andrei Mubarak.
A fantastic resource.
He's a teacher and a tour guide based in Jerusalem, and get this, he's an Aramaic-speaking Christian. That's right, he lives in Jerusalem today, and he dedicates his time to teaching about the Aramaic roots of Christianity. If you're interested in learning more, and I think you really should be, you can check out his website at www.twinsbiblicalacademy.com.
It's a treasure trove of information.
So our mission today is clear-cut, to figure out, really figure out, who Babai the Great was, what he achieved, and importantly, why he still matters to us today. We'll be untangling his theological innovations, exploring his impact on monastic life, and understanding his broader significance for Eastern Christianity as a whole. Get ready for some aha moments, some surprises, as we unpack the world of this incredibly influential figure.
It's going to be a fascinating journey.
So to kick things off, can you paint us a picture of Babai the Great? Who was he? When did he live? And why is he considered such a giant in the history of the Church of the East?
Well, Babai the Great, he lived roughly from 551 to 628 AD. He's considered a titan, a true giant in the history of the Church of the East, because he basically shaped their theology and their monastic life.
Shaped their theology, shaped their monastic life. That's a huge claim. Can you break that down for us? What made his contributions so essential, so necessary at that specific moment?
Right, so you got to understand, the Church of the East, they were going through a lot back then. You had this external pressure, this looming presence of the Sasanian Persian Empire.
A powerful empire.
Extremely powerful. And then internally, within the church itself, you had all these theological disputes bubbling up. So Babai, he steps into this scene and he lays down the law, so to speak. He establishes clear doctrines. He sets down firm guidelines for monastic life. And this brings about this sense of stability, this much-needed direction that echoes down the centuries.
So he's kind of like a stabilizing force in a time of chaos, both from outside the church and within it. And you said his influence wasn't just temporary, that it's still felt today.
Oh, absolutely. His legacy, it's still very much alive. You can see his influence in the modern Assyrian Church of the East. It's remarkable how his ideas, his vision, continues to resonate.
That's really incredible to have that kind of enduring impact. So let's talk about the man behind these monumental contributions. What can we glean from the historical record about his early life? Where was he born? What was his family like? And what kind of education did he receive?
Well, Babai the Great, he was born around 551 CE in this place called Beth Ainada near Nisibis. Nisibis was a hub, a real center of intellectual life at that time. But when it comes to his family background, the accounts are a bit muddy.
Oh, how so?
Some say he was from humble means, others say he came from a wealthy family. It's one of those historical mysteries we might never fully solve.
History is full of those little gaps, those mysteries that keep us guessing. But what about his education? Where did he get his intellectual grounding?
He started, like many did back then, with studying Persian, the Pahlavi texts.
A good foundation?
Exactly, the basics. But then he went on to the Christian school of Nisibis. It was like the Harvard or Oxford of its day.
And this school, it wasn't just any school. You mentioned it was going through a transition around that time.
Right. A new headmaster came in, Hinana of Adiabini. He was, let's say, an admirer of Origen's teachings, which were a bit controversial. This prompted Abraham of Beth Rabban, who was Babai's mentor, to break away and establish his own monastery on Mount Isla. So Babai, he was exposed to this theological tension early on.
So already he's seeing these intellectual debates, these different approaches to Christianity playing out right in front of him. It sounds like Abraham was a pretty influential figure in his life.
Oh, absolutely. A major influence. In fact, after Babai finished his studies, he taught for a while at the Zinodotio in Nisibis. It's kind of like a hospice, but then, drawn by his mentor, he joined Abraham at his monastery on Mount Isla. This would prove to be a pivotal turning point.
A turning point, how so? Did it directly lead to his more prominent roles within the church?
You could say that. When Abraham died in 588 CE, Babai. He went back home and founded his own monastery and school in Beth Sabdai.
So he takes what he's learned and starts spreading it, putting it into practice.
Exactly. But then, in 604 CE, he's back on Mount Isla, this time as the abbot, the head honcho. And this is where he really starts pushing his reforms, making big changes.
And this is where that whole unofficial head of the church thing comes in, right?
Yeah, that's right. So the head of the Church of the East, the Catholicos, he dies in 608 or 609 CE. And King Chosroes II, he's the Persian king at the time, he blocks the appointment of a successor.
So there's a power vacuum at the top.
Exactly. So Babai and another big name, Mar Abba, they step up, essentially become the unofficial leaders until Babai dies in 628 CE. It shows how much people trusted him, how much authority he had.
Wow. Leading the church during a time when the official leadership is basically frozen by political interference, that's a serious responsibility. But it's not all he did, right? You mentioned he was also appointed as a monastic visitor. What exactly did that role involve?
Right, so the bishops, they actually appointed him as a kind of inspector, a visitor, to monasteries in northern Persia. His job was to deal with these groups that were popping up, groups they considered heretical, like the Massalians.
That's sort of like a theological troubleshooter.
Exactly. He was tasked with ensuring the monasteries were sticking to the accepted doctrines, maintaining the integrity of the faith. So, yeah, a lot of responsibility on his shoulders.
It's clear he was a leader on multiple levels. He headed his own monastic community, effectively led the entire church during a crisis, and he was safeguarding the faith in other monasteries. This really sets the stage for his contributions, which were quite vast. Let's dive into his theological work, specifically his development of what's called Diophysite theology. Can you explain what that means and why it was so groundbreaking?
This is probably Babai's most lasting contribution. See, in those early centuries of Christianity, there was this huge debate, a really heated one, about the nature of Christ. How could he be both God and human at the same time?
A fundamental question.
Absolutely fundamental. And the Church of the East, they had their own particular answer, what we call diophysitism. Basically, they believed in two distinct natures in Christ, one fully divine, one fully human, existing side by side.
Two complete natures in one person. And Babai's work was crucial in defining and defending this position.
Totally. He came up with this really influential formula. Two hypostases in a union of person.
Hypostases. Okay. For those of us who aren't theologians, can you unpack that a bit? What exactly does that mean?
Sure. Think of hypostases as the individual reality of something. Like you are a hypostasis, I am a hypostasis. We each have our own distinct existence.
Okay, so like two distinct entities.
Right. And person then is that unified who that emerges from those two distinct realities coming together. So for Babai, Christ had two hypostases, two distinct realities, but they were united in one person. It's how he explained how Christ could be both fully God and fully human without those natures getting all mixed up or watered down.
So distinct but unified. He's really threading a very fine theological needle here. And this had a huge impact on how the Church of the East understood Christ's attributes.
Big time. It led to a particular understanding of the communication of properties. This is the idea that attributes of both natures, both divine and human, could be attributed to Christ. So, for example, when we say Jesus suffered on the cross, that's referring to his human nature. But when we say Jesus is all-knowing, that's referring to his divine nature.
And Babai argued that these attributes could be applied to the single person of Christ because of this union of hypostases.
Exactly. But he was very careful about how he applied this communication of properties. He didn't want to say that the human nature became divine because that would undermine the idea of God's absolute transcendence.
So he's maintaining a very delicate balance, making sure the distinction between the divine and human remains clear while still affirming their unity in the person of Christ. And it's fascinating how he brought in medical knowledge to support his theological arguments. You don't see that very often in early Christian writings.
You really don't. It was quite innovative. He used the medical understanding of his time, particularly regarding the development of the fetus in the womb, to argue for the close connection between body and soul in Christ. It was a way of grounding his theological ideas in the scientific knowledge of his day.
So he's not afraid to draw on different disciplines, different ways of knowing, to bolster his arguments. A true intellectual.
For sure. And this actually makes him a forerunner of this trend we see later on in East Syrian theology, this integration of medical ideas into theological discussions.
It sounds like he was very much in conversation with the intellectual currents of his time, but he was also very much on the defensive against other theological systems. Can you talk about these groups he was opposed to and his approach to dealing with them?
Babai, he was a fierce defender of what he saw as true doctrine, true Christianity. And he saw threats all around him, threats to the integrity of the faith. Groups like the Massalians, the Severians, the followers of his old rival Hanana of Adiabene.
And each of these groups posed a different kind of challenge.
Yes, each one had their own particular set of beliefs that Babai saw as problematic, as deviating from what he believed was true Christianity.
And how did he deal with these perceived threats? Was he open to dialogue, to finding common ground?
Not at all. He was completely uncompromising. He believed these groups were so fundamentally wrong, so dangerous, that he advocated for complete avoidance, no engagement whatsoever.
A very hardline stance. So he's a defender of the faith, but he's also a reformer of monastic life. You mentioned that his impact on monasticism was as significant as his theological contributions. What exactly did these reforms involve?
Well, when he went back to Mount Isla as the abbot in 604, he immediately started tightening things up, making the rules stricter. He was building on what his predecessor, Abraham the Great, had started, but he took it even further.
So stricter rules, stricter practices. Give us some concrete examples. What kind of changes did he implement?
One of the biggest and most controversial was the expulsion of monks who were living with women. It caused quite a stir.
Living with women within the monastery. That seems like a pretty significant departure from traditional monastic life. What was the context for this?
Right, so the Synod of Beth-Lapat, they had actually encouraged marriage for monks and nuns. It was a more relaxed approach to monasticism. But Babai, he was a traditionalist. He believed in the strict separation of the sexes.
And he took drastic measures to enforce this view.
He did. There's this account in Thomas of Marga's Book of Governors, where Babai finds these monks living with women. Some even had children, and he's appalled.
And his response was to expel them and burn down their dwellings.
It was a pretty dramatic response, you could say. But it shows how serious he was about maintaining the purity, the strictness of monastic life. He believed monks should avoid women completely, at all costs, always and everywhere.
That's a pretty strong statement. It sounds almost misogynistic.
It's important to note that while he was very strict on this point, he wasn't necessarily against women in general. His writings do show respect for certain biblical women, like Susanna. His focus was on the ascetic discipline of monastic life.
So it was about maintaining a particular lifestyle, a particular kind of spiritual purity. So his reforms weren't just about prohibitions. What was his broader vision for monastic life? What was the ultimate goal?
For Babai, the goal was perfection, spiritual perfection. And he saw this as a constant striving, a never-ending process of self-discipline and contemplation. He laid out some pretty demanding requirements, things like constant endeavor for perfection, love of solitude and quietness, binding oneself in asceticism, despising the body, and love for humiliations, control of thought, guarding of feelings, and conquering the inclinations.
Wow, that's a pretty intense list. It sounds like he was calling for a complete transformation of the individual, both internally and externally.
Absolutely. And at the heart of it all was prayer. He considered it the most important activity for a monk.
And what did that look like in practice? Did he prescribe specific ways of praying?
He did. He advocated for things like midnight prayer, praying for your enemies, and always ensuring your prayer was accompanied by chaste behavior and constancy. It wasn't just about the words you said, but about the whole attitude, the whole way of life.
So a holistic approach to prayer, integrating it into every aspect of monastic life. It sounds like he was very concerned with the quality of spiritual guidance within these monastic communities as well.
Very much so. He was wary of false teachers, people who could lead monks astray. He stressed the importance of finding a good teacher, someone who actually lived what they preached, someone who was spiritually grounded, humble, and consistent in their teachings.
And ideally not a town dweller, right?
That's right. He preferred teachers who lived in solitude, away from the distractions of the world. It was all about creating that space for deep contemplation, for that inner transformation.
So finding the right guide was crucial. Now let's move on to his literary contributions. You mentioned he was a prolific writer, especially known for his commentaries on Evagrius of Pontus. Can you tell us a little about Evagrius and why Babai was so interested in his work?
Evagrius was a 4th century monk, an Egyptian, and he was hugely influential in developing early monastic thought, particularly around asceticism. Babai wrote 3 commentaries on Evagrius, and these were really important because they helped bridge the gap between the Egyptian and East Syrian monastic traditions.
So he's not just explaining Evagrius, he's adapting his ideas for a different context, a different monastic culture. And what other kinds of things did he write about?
He wrote a whole bunch of his own stuff too, mostly on asceticism and mysticism. Think of them as practical guides for monks, offering both theological insights and very specific advice on things like prayer, fasting, dealing with temptations, that kind of thing.
So he's providing both the theory and the practice, giving monks the tools they need to live out this very demanding way of life. And we also heard about his development of contemplative reading. Can you explain what that is and why it was so significant?
Contemplative reading, it's not just reading for information. It's a way of reading that's meant to transform you, to lead you closer to God. It's about engaging with the text on a deeper level, meditating on it, letting it shape your heart and mind.
And Babai, he wasn't just advocating for this kind of reading, he was also providing a model for it through his commentaries on Evagrius.
Exactly. He was showing monks how to read Evagrius in a way that fostered this kind of contemplative engagement. And this approach, it had a ripple effect throughout the Church of the East. It led to a growing separation between the more academic style of reading practiced in the schools and this more spiritual, contemplative reading that was taking root in the monasteries.
So it's not just about what you read, but how you read it. And for Babai, the how was just as important as the what. Now let's talk about his understanding of human nature, what we call theological anthropology. What was his take on human nature and its potential for transformation?
For Babai, humans were created in the image of God, but we're also fallen, broken. And the goal of life, especially for monks, is to overcome that brokenness, to become more and more like God. He called this perfection, but he had a very nuanced understanding. Well, he saw perfection as a two-stage process. There's a kind of natural perfection that you can achieve in this life through discipline and ascetic practice. But the true ultimate perfection, that's a gift from God, something you receive in the afterlife.
So there's a journey towards perfection in this life, but the destination is ultimately in the next. And where did the resurrection of the body fit into all this?
For Babai, the resurrection, it wasn't just about the body coming back to life. It was about the body being transformed, glorified, made perfect. He believed the resurrected body would still be recognizable, you'd still be you, but it would be healed, free from corruption, radiant with divine light.
So a continuation of this earthly life, but on a whole other level, a perfected level.
Exactly. It's all about this process of transformation, of becoming more and more like God, both in this life and the next.
So looking back at his life, his work, his legacy, how would you sum up his overall significance both for the Church of the East and for Christianity as a whole?
Babai the Great, he was a towering figure. He gave the Church of the East their distinctive theology, their Christology. He revitalized their monastic life, made it stricter, more focused, and he led them through a time of immense political upheaval, keeping the church together when it could have easily fractured.
So he's a theologian, a reformer, a leader, all rolled into one.
And his impact, it's still felt today. The modern Syrian Church of the East, they still look to him as a guiding light.
What about his broader significance, his contribution to Christian thought beyond the Church of the East?
Well, he's a key figure in the development of East Syrian theology. He represents this move towards a more sophisticated understanding of how humans participate in the divine life. He also anticipates later trends with his integration of medical knowledge into theological discussions. And his blending of Egyptian and East Syrian ascetic traditions, that's a unique contribution that continues to shape Eastern Christian spirituality today.
And we have to remember, he was doing all this in a very specific historical context, under the rule of the Sasanian-Persian Empire. What does his story tell us about the challenges and the resilience of the early church in that part of the world?
It tells us that even under immense pressure, even with political interference and theological disputes raging all around, the church found a way to not only survive, but to thrive. It tells us about the power of strong leadership, the importance of clear doctrines, and the enduring appeal of a life dedicated to spiritual discipline and the pursuit of perfection.
And Babai the Great, he embodied all of that. He was a true architect, a builder, a leader who left an indelible mark on the Church of the East and on the broader history of Christianity.
Absolutely. His story deserves to be known. His contributions deserve to be remembered.
And we hope that this deep dive has helped to do just that, to shed light on this often overlooked figure and his lasting legacy. We want to thank Andre Mubarak again for his excellent research, which made this exploration possible. And remember, you can find out more about Andre's work on his website, www.twinsbiblicalacademy.com. He's a treasure trove of knowledge about the Aramaic roots of our faith. As you reflect on what we've discussed today, what aspects of Babai the Great's life or theology stood out to you? What questions did this deep dive raise for you? We encourage you to continue exploring the rich and fascinating world of Syriac Christianity. Thanks for joining us on the deep dive.